When Jesus had crossed in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around and to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Jesus allowed no one to follow him. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then Jesus put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about, for she was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with astonishment. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
My dear brothers and sisters, every time we celebrate Mass, and often whenever we approach the Lord in any way, but above all, come to celebrate the Mass and make Christ present on the altar for ourselves and for our own sacrifice, we examine our conscience and place ourselves in the only truly proper and just position before the Lord, as sinners, as creatures, as weak, and with a past and a future that we know is always a struggle in this world. And it's the ordinary place of the Church for all of us, and every time we approach the Lord in His holiness, it's an ordinary step that we take. Just like in the Old Testament, when those who approach something holy would take their shoes off, as many places and many cultures still do in the world today, as a sign of the lowliness of who we are in comparison to the holiness that we approach. And for ourselves, especially with what's been going on in the news, especially with the residential school and so many other things that take place in the church and have taken place in the church before, I think it's so important for us to remember that the only reason the church is holy is because Christ is in the church and he's the foundation and head of the church. And there's nothing that we do except the graces and the gifts that he gives to his faithful in holiness that enlighten the church aside from himself. Everything comes from Christ and everything returns to Christ in the end, and nothing is there in the church for us to brag about or to say that something is held up in any way. And this is a disposition which is so central for all of us when we recognize that we're coming to church or a member baptized into the church, or as we approach God and our brothers and sisters. With what's been taking place in the residential school issues and concerns of the discoveries in the past weeks, I thought it was time to go back and do some reading and just to see what was going on. I was ordained a bishop in 2007, and so that's almost 14 years ago now. And it was the first time in many ways that I was introduced to this issue, especially from my brother bishops, but above all also the indigenous leaders that existed in the diocese where I first served, and the sessions we had of listening and understanding as best I could in a very weak way the nature of the church's involvement in the residential schools and many other things in the approach to the indigenous peoples. And so I thought, even though 2007 isn't too long ago, I better go back and start to read some more things, and I invite all of us to look at the webpage for the Canadian bishops and how informative it was for me. And went back to the documents and realized that this first session of listening of the effects of the residential school thing took place in March of 1991. And a document followed, a very beautiful document prepared for one of the royal commissions at the time, prepared by the bishops, but written in many ways by a few bishops, including the previous deceased Bishop of Kingston, Archbishop of Kingston, Archbishop Spence. And it followed upon that first listening session that took place 30 years ago in Saskatchewan, when courageously, and this very, very important, this experience myself, the indigenous leaders and those who had been affected by this were willing to speak about something which was very, very difficult for them. And those who listened, representing the churches, responded in writing, but also at the time, with a profound examination of conscience on behalf of the church, to begin a process, beginning first with an apology, and then a process of continuing collaboration and service and assistance to all the indigenous peoples that were in our diocese across the country. And that process has continued, and it's hit many bumps on the road, some of the most severe bumps probably in the last 6 months or so. But to see that there's something still to be followed through. And I first of all remark on the great courage from the indigenous communities of those that I experienced as well, who were willing to come and speak to me and to others who were gathered with me, and to speak of the difficulties that they'd had. And that's not an easy thing to do, but the response that every one of us should have, and the church itself, is an examination of how we ever got involved in something like this to begin with. And then also the response that we have at the beginning of Mass, confessing our own sins and making reparation for the sins of all the world, including the members of the church in the past. Reparation in prayer, reparation in thought and concern and in love, and in material things however we can. But it was very instructive to me to see the courageous leadership, especially from the indigenous community, to address this issue and to continue the dialogue and the journey with our church and with many other churches to continue to move forward. And I leave that with us as an invitation to read that, to see the graces that have been there, but also the challenges, and really some seemingly insurmountable challenges at times going forward, that only healing that we see in the gospel today can be provided by the Lord. And the example that we show in our disposition of humility, of a constant examination of our conscience, which we do liturgically and daily, every one of us, and to know where the holiness and healing power resides, it resides with Christ. Today in the gospel, Jesus gets out of the boat. He encounters a Roman citizen who begs for his daughter who is dying. And then in the midst of that story, because it comes back and finishes at the end, a woman who has been suffering for many, many years, and we can see the symbolism for humanity itself, has the courage and the longing for healing, and has the courage to approach Jesus in the crowd and touch his cloak with a faith that maybe something will take place because I've heard about this man. And immediately Jesus, knowing that power had left him, a very, very insightful phrase for us in the nature of God himself, knowing that power had left him, turned around in the crowd and wanted to know who it was that his grace had healed. And she comes forward and he encounters her and gives her the strength and courage to go forward to say that her healing has come from the holiness of God and from her faith in the faith that given to God. And then the story returns back to that first episode of the healing of the child who has died and given back to the parents. But to see in ourselves individually and as a church, that longing for healing and that longing for Christ ourselves, which sometimes is an instinctive thing within us that we can't even put words to, that humanity is looking for its fullness. Humanity is looking for its own holiness, which it realizes then comes from Christ. And then the courage in the crowd to go forward and touch the one and the source that is the healing. And then for the cognizant God, aware fully of what's taking place, knowing that healing has taken place as something that he wished. Put ourselves in the mind of God in the little, terrible way we can in our weakness to realize how much he wishes that power to go out into the world through his church and through the sacraments. How much then we need to be instruments for music here.
Dad, I'll never put this on record.
Who knows? Something jamming our system here, maybe. We had this in an old church I was before. There was a radio station close by, and it was just blaring every once in a while. So, this they leave with us, the last thing, just this. Be aware of Christ as that source of holiness and the power that resides him, the one who has given himself in humility, emptied himself completely to show to us the sign of how we need to do that for one another. And we've spoken of that so many times, especially the mystery of Easter, and we see it in ourselves today, never putting place in confidence in ourselves except in the graces that God has granted to us and to his church. And we make that a prayer going forward these days, as well as a commitment to our indigenous peoples, but also all those who suffer and anyone who suffered at the hands of the church and continues to suffer in the world today.